we get ready to go into the sermon here, there's something I was going to point out. I sat and talked to Pam's dad's pastor, Mitch Jackson, the other night while he was in surgery. And of course, Mitch is at Minor Baptist, and that's a pretty large church. I don't know how many members they have, 400, 500, something like that. It's a pretty large church. And we were discussing the fact, though, that, and I don't know if you know, but over 90% of the churches in the United States are below 100 members, okay, or have less than 100 in attendance. And so he was just talking about the importance of having all those churches. Where would those people be if they weren't in those small churches? And I said, well, I've always said that people that come to a smaller church make a little bit more commitment because you can't hide in the crowd here. Okay, you can't miss 3 weeks and somebody say where they. You could miss 3 weeks and somebody not really notice because maybe they went Saturday night, maybe went some. You missed 3 weeks here, I'm probably going to call you, or just check or send you a note or something. But I just thought I'd point that out and was thinking about that as. Sometimes we just have to be flexible also in smaller churches. Because you know what? Just like Aspen said last week with the music, it may not be perfect today, but it was worship. And that was a good song, and if we'd noticed ahead of time, we'd said only sing three verses, but you know what? What's the big deal? It doesn't matter. We sing Joyful, Joyful. It's a great song. Sermon today is called Tears of Mercy, and it's based on Luke 19:35 through 41. And this is of a more traditional. We are not into the sermon series right now. We're going to take a couple Sundays off to do good traditional Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Easter services. Luke 19:35 through 41 says, they brought it to Jesus. It meaning the colt, the donkey. Threw their cloaks on the colt and put Jesus on it. As they went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The day will come when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone or another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Palm Sunday today is the day the church traditionally marks the entrance of Jesus into the city, and we start marking what's called the week of Passion, or the last week of Jesus' life. And as I said earlier, it's not the exact date, but we follow somewhat of a Jewish calendar this time of year, and we may not realize it, but Easter is kind of determined by Passover, which is a very intricate system, but Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. So Easter is about as late as it can be this year, but Passover always falls the same week. Okay? So if you were Jewish this week, you would be selling Passover as well. And it's an event that, this week is an event that brings great insight and a lot of misunderstanding in many ways. The great insight was that this Jesus really is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, which Luke 19:38 says. He was the Messiah, the Son of David, the long-awaited ruler of Israel, and the fulfillment of all of God's private promises. So that was the insight. But the misunderstanding was that he would enter Jerusalem, not by his mighty works, not by power and might, and not with weapons, and not go sit on a throne, and not free the people from Rome. Now, I read a devotion this morning that pointed out something that I never realized. There were 2 processions on Palm Sunday. This is not necessarily in the Bible, but it's a historical fact, because if you noticed, it said that Jesus came from the city from the side of the Mount of Olives. While Jesus came in the east gate, there was another royal procession going on. In the west gate, Pontius Pilate was being greeted, and people were cheering and shouting for the Romans because Pilate, who was the governor over Jerusalem, stayed out of their business most of the time. But during Passover, a lot of the Jews were known to get a little unruly. Or if you remember last week, we talked about wine and the Jewish saying, there is no joy without wine. So they might have got a little drunk and unruly. So Pilate always showed up during Passover just to kind of have his presence known. So on the other side of town, there was a whole other procession going on of the Romans coming into town too. So I found that very interesting because that all kind of comes into play. You know, those worlds are going to collide just like they're getting ready to collide in this procession. It wasn't going to be that way. Jesus wasn't going to come into a throne. He wasn't going to have anger or lightning flashing from his fist. He wasn't going to be riding a war horse. His was going to be a voluntary suffering and death and then a resurrection, but nobody understood that. Palm Sunday was a day of insight and a day of misunderstanding. And Jesus knew it, and he saw it all coming. So Jesus knew what was about to happen when the Pharisees were going to get he knew the Pharisees were going to get the upper hand before the week was out. He knew the people would be fickle and follow their leaders and cover their backsides, and that he would ultimately be rejected and crucified because by the end he was basically alone. On Sunday he has a ton of followers. Wow, it could almost be in the news today, couldn't it? Someone with tons of followers and gets caught with a hashtag me something, and within a day, everything's gone. Same concept. Within a generation, the whole city of Jerusalem, so within 40 years, the whole city of Jerusalem would be obliterated and the temple torn down. And Jesus saw it all. He knew what was coming. Verse 41 through 42 says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make peace, that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes." Jesus wept over the blindness and the impending misery of Jerusalem. How would you describe those tears? Jesus wept. That's actually the shortest verse in the Bible, but that's not the one right here. But Jesus wept over Jerusalem. Was it out of sorrow? Was it out of anger? Was it out of agony? Or was it out of joy? Jesus wept because he knew what was coming. How sad he must have been. There must have been tremendous sorrow in Jesus' heart. He knew that the crowds were going to turn on him. He knew the disciples that were with him would slowly turn away. He knew that the ones he loved would betray him. And he looked at a city much as we look at someone we know is in their last days, with heavy hearts and a desire to change things, but knowing you can't change it. Maybe those tears Jesus wept were of anger. Some people cry when they get intensely angry. I don't know that I do, but some people get intensely angry and they cry. It just happens, and I won't point at anyone. Was Jesus angry about what was going to happen? He was all man. So was he angry? Was Jesus questioning why he had to be the one? You know, if it was us, we'd be saying, God, why me? Why did you pick me? Why me? It's often why me, even if it's just simple enough that, you got the wrong line at the grocery store. Why me? Why is it always got to be me? Okay? Was he angry at the people who questioned him? Was he angry at his own Father? Was he angry at the followers who he knew were going to betray him and reject him? Were those tears maybe of agony for what was to come? There was the spiritual side of it. The heartache of having people turn against you. We've all had that at some point. We've had someone we trusted betray our trust. And that's its own kind of hurt. The heartache of knowing that people close to you, the heartache of knowing what people close to you would be feeling as the week goes on, because Jesus had a lot of empathy. And the heartache of knowing that Jerusalem would be destroyed. That's the spiritual side. The physical side, the agony side, is Jesus knew he would be flogged, he'd be forced to wear a crown of thorns, he'd be forced to carry his own cross, and ultimately he'd be forced to be crucified. And it was one of the most horrible deaths anyone could have. And then there was the whole emotional side. Knowing that that day set the plan in motion. And once it's set in motion, it cannot be stopped. Watching your mother on the Via Dolorosa, the way that Jesus had to carry his cross, looking at his followers as he's carrying his own cross. I believe the tears were a combination of all these things. Sometimes a combination of all these different things rolled into one emotion is called mercy. The blessing that's an act of divine favor.